It's the holiday season in New York City, and NYPD officer Aya Brea is going on a date to the opera. She's unenthused by the man that she's with, but she's still very eager to see the show. However, as the first act starts to ramp up, the lead actress locks eyes with Aya and transforms before the entire audience. As if in response to the transformation, several audience members burst into flames, but Aya herself is somehow completely fine. Despite being a relatively inexperienced officer, Aya leaps into action, starting off a 6-day odyssey where she'll attempt to solve the mystery of the actress and, in doing so, also learn the truth about herself. Hi everyone, I'm your host, Ketten Ram Clink, and this video is part of a series called Games I Should Have Played By Now. Simply put, this is how I'm going to be reviewing games that I've heard about countless times over the years, but I've never taken the time to play. To be frank, a lot of them are going to be older JRPGs, but I also want to branch out and try other genres somewhere down the line. This is going to be the first game of the series, so I figured let's start off with something a bit familiar in terms of genre, but also a bit unknown. Parasite Eve is a PS1 game that was released in 1998 by Squaresoft, the legendary company most known for the Final Fantasy series. However, it should be noted that Parasite Eve is, in its own right, a very important title as it not only deviated from what was expected of Squaresoft in the 90s, but because of how good the game was and still is. Many fans of the game would put Parasite Eve in the same conversations as gaming giants like Resident Evil, which made it a title of great interest to me over the years, especially because of how it uniquely blends genres together. The game straddles this fine line between JRPG and survival horror, and though I have very minimal experience in the latter genre, there are enough genre isms present in this game that even I could recognize, like odd camera angles and limited inventory space. The game's story is relatively straightforward and feels like a 90s box office blockbuster. The many different locations in the game contribute greatly to this feeling, and the story moves pretty fast, with only Day 5 feeling a bit longer than the rest. The plot itself is mostly fun science fiction nonsense that stems from like the one thing everyone knows about the mitochondria, with a dash of surprisingly grotesque horror. The most garish and horrific things that appear on screen are the monster designs, and I adore them because of how gross they are in concept as well as how repulsive they look in the game's full-motion video sequences. In contrast to the monster designs, the character designs are pretty straightforward, but the characters themselves are pretty memorable. Designed by Tetsuya Nomura, Aya Brea is a cute, blonde, playable character that doesn't outwardly emote much, but kicks a whole lot of ass. Oh, that sounds familiar. Throughout the story, she has moments where she shows the wider range of emotion she's capable of, but I feel like she doesn't deviate too much from the expectations she sets for herself. She actually almost suffers a bit from Solid Snake syndrome, where like a decent amount of her dialogue is her asking questions or just reacting to things being explained to her, but just like Snake, enough character is eked out of these moments to make her a protagonist that's both worth following and that I want a lot more of. Her companions are also pretty memorable in their own right. Daniel, a veteran cop who goes through life always choosing the renegade option, is made sympathizable by means of his relationship to his son. He's also equally as badass as Aya, having quite a few standout moments in the game that definitely help cement him in my mind as an integral part of the Parasite Eve experience. The third member of the trio is Maeda, a Japanese scientist who comes to New York in order to help solve the mystery of Eve. Although he's a scientist, he holds what can be considered some pretty strong superstitious belief, seen in the good luck charms that he gives Aya throughout the game. His presence helps complement the cool-headedness of Aya and the hot-headedness of Daniel by adding a bit of a neurotic, worrisome center to their group. Despite that, Maeda is a useful member of the cast, and by the end of the game, is another character I feel to be integral to the game's experience. As for how the game plays, the combat is where its genre blending really shines best, as it combines the active time bar present in the Final Fantasy series with semi-real-time action. The player is able to freely control Aya's movement in order to dodge enemy attacks and move to advantageous positions before choosing an action once the ATB fills up. However, every battlefield feels claustrophobic, limiting Aya's options and also making it easier for enemies to punish the player. This adds both a layer of strategy and a layer of tension to each encounter, as the player needs to plan and time moves according to the ATB and the enemy's actions. But they also need to be wary of certain enemy attacks and debuffs that can send them barreling down an unforgiving path to a game over. Couple these layers with Aya's relatively small health pool, abysmal running speed, and the fact that multiple enemies can attack at once, and the combat can easily bounce between straightforward and fun to challenging and then even infuriating within the same dungeon. Now, while the combat system really highlights the best of this game's strange genre blend, I feel like the rest of the game incorporates survival horror limitations and JRPG elements well, but it just has trouble sustaining their balance throughout a secondary and possibly even an initial playthrough. Players with enough patience can render the survival horror limitations practically useless, as like in all JRPGs. Grinding and min-maxing can completely break your character, making the majority of the game pretty simple outside of learning certain boss mechanics. Even the inventory limitation, a necessary staple of survival horror, can be surpassed with a bit of grinding. I do think that the game plays well and can be tense at the early levels, but the customization options for guns and armor, alongside the ability to increase inventory space and ATB speed through the bonus point system, turns a lot of the game's late game horror into minor inconveniences at worst. All this being said, my first playthrough of the game, before the New Game Plus X game, was very enjoyable, especially learning the systems and the boss mechanics in order to make sure Aya survives her ordeals. My EX game save, however, was basically a rehash of the story with an emphasis on leveling in order to tackle the game's secret dungeon, the Chrysler Building. The Chrysler Building itself can be pretty unforgiving, as the majority of its floors are randomized and you fight enemies in the higher floors that you never see in the regular game. The design of the building makes it a bit difficult to traverse as well, as room designs repeat, and if you aren't careful, you may find yourself traveling in a big circle. There are also no save points in the building, with the closest being the NYPD station. Additionally, every 10 floors is a boss fight, with the majority of them being mechanically similar to bosses you fight throughout the story. Some of their health pools get pretty large, and the later bosses have mechanics that hit pretty hard too, even if you have the better gear that you can find in the Chrysler Building. Regardless, this dungeon is definitely optional for a reason. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but if extra challenges, extra gear, and a secret ending are your jam, then definitely give this dungeon a shot. The last thing I wanted to talk about for this game are the final bosses, since I feel like they're easily two of the most memorable parts of this game. So spoilers. The game's final boss, the Ultimate Being, is a 4-phase borderline eldritch horror that constantly evolves and becomes more aggressive as it transforms. Despite that, I feel like its second phase is easily the most annoying to deal with because of how much is going on at once. Of course, the final boss can't be discussed without mentioning the unforgiving chase sequence after all of it. I like this choice in concept, but making people redo the fight if they mess up on the chase sequence is the kind of sadistic design decisions that I'm glad got left in the 90s. That being said, the chase sequence itself actually had my heart pounding as I desperately guided Aya through the ship. Easily one of my favorite parts of the game. The secret boss is much more straightforward, and there's a lot less cutscene to rewatch if you need to restart the boss fight, so repeating the fight isn't too harsh on the player. However, original Eve's health pool alone caused every attempt at this fight to last about 20 minutes apiece, so although I feel her health pool is ludicrous, I still feel like it's very in line with JRPG secret boss standards anyway, and it helps make this fight a lot more memorable. I was even more tense during this fight than during the fight with the Ultimate Being. It took me about 3 hours of in-game time to beat original Eve, but I'm proud to say I actually did it. Not so pro tip, pre-raise and haste are practically cheat codes in this fight. I thank God for them. I would not have finished this game without it. All in all, I heavily enjoyed my time with Parasite Eve. I especially love the combat and the way the JRPG and survival horror genres are blended together. The monster designs are easily one of my favorite parts of this game, and I also really enjoyed the chemistry between the main cast, and I want to see more of them. One day, I'll play the sequel, but until then, I'll continually hold my experience with Parasite Eve in high regard, and I highly recommend trying it if you haven't, especially if you like JRPGs or survival horror games. Once again, I have been Kettenram Clink. Thank you for listening to me ramble, and I hope you have a very nice day.